In this video, we're going to talk about 5 things that can serve as early traction indicators for your no-code app. Now, when I say early traction indicators, what I mean are things or factors that can add to the value of your app, the validation of your app, and even to your competitive advantage. So these are 5 things where if you have any, some, or all of these already in place, or you have a plan for putting these in place, they're signs that you're going to have an easier chance of building quick traction when you launch your app to your first users. Now, make sure you stick around until the end because we're going to talk about how within each of these 5 factors, you can either use them to your advantage, or if you don't have them in place, how they could affect you negatively as well. So you're going to want to stick around for all of this. Now, first, if you're new around here, my name is Kristen, and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help non-technical entrepreneurs build custom apps so they can launch their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses all without coding. All right, so we're over on the whiteboard here, and I know I just said we have 5 indicators of early traction with your app, but you see 6 circles on the screen here. And that's because there's a base layer that you must have in place in order to really have any traction with your app at all. And that is that you solve a problem. Okay, so before we talk about any other factors that could add to your validation, the value of your app, or your competitive advantage, you got to make sure you have this in place. If you don't know what problem you're solving, that means that you're thinking of a product first, but value comes from solving a problem and enabling certain outcomes or results. So instead of thinking features or product first, make sure you're thinking outcomes first. What is your app going to enable your users to do or achieve? So before anything else, you have to have this in place. Now, assuming you do, we can look at these other 5 factors. And remember, these are going to help indicate early signs of validation for your idea or for your product, early signs of value for your users. In other words, signs that your users are going to be more likely, willing, and happy to pay for your solution, and signs of more distinct competitive advantages. So that means if there are other existing alternatives, maybe other apps, other softwares out on the market, your app can shine above the rest. Okay, so the first thing beyond solving a problem that I want you to think about is your passion. Now, I know this sounds simple and maybe a bit too untechnical for some of you, but bear with me here because this can be such a major competitive advantage that people overlook so often. A lot of people, and this kind of goes back to what we were just saying about thinking product first or feature first versus outcome first. A lot of people, they think about what is going to potentially make them the most money, or what is going to potentially be the most lucrative venture. And yeah, those things are important. You are building and launching an app so you can grow a business, so that you can, build wealth for yourself potentially, so you can drive wealth, right? But you have to make sure that you have some sort of passion for this. And again, it's so often overlooked, but think about it this way. If you are building an app and someone else is building literally the exact same app, the person with the more passion in the game is going to come out on top every single time. They just are, because passion can really serve as kind of like a lifeline over the long run. When you're building an app and when you're building a business, there are going to be highs and lows. Unquestionably, there just are. And it's in the low points where the passion gets you back up to the high points. If you don't have a real desire to be providing your users with a solution that enables them to achieve an outcome, I'm going to emphasize that a lot. If you don't have any sort of drive for that, then you're going to have a hard time competing in any sort of competitive market, really, and doing so over the long run, right? You gotta be able to bring yourself out of the lows, which will happen, and into the highs. And the passion is going to help you get there. So ultimately, if you have this in as one of the tools in your kit, this is going to be a driver for you, especially in competitive markets. It will be so incredibly important in helping you build up really just success and longevity with your business. And if you don't have this, if you are just not feeling it, if all you're thinking about is the potential of money and there's literally nothing else in it for you, then you are going to struggle in the long run, okay? Because this isn't a sprint, okay? This is something that you're going to be doing over the long run. So passion. Moving forward from that, we have something a little bit different. When you are filling a hole in your market, this is something that can give you another big leg up. It can be a sign of early validation. It can certainly serve as a really strong competitive advantage for you. And it can also provide a lot of value for your users. So when you are looking at existing alternatives within your market, and existing alternatives are just solutions to the problem you're solving. They don't have to be other apps, although they can be. They can also be things like spreadsheets. They can be things like pen and paper, whiteboards, post-it notes, employees, okay? Any existing alternatives that are currently solving the problem that your app is intended to solve. Now, when you are launching your app, you don't want to just build the same thing people are already using. Instead, you want to find pain points that exist in those solutions that are already being used, and you want to fill those holes. So if you think about existing alternatives and you find those little areas where there are still gaps in the solution, and these don't have to be big, these don't have to be widespread, maybe it's certain gaps for certain segments of a market. So if you can create a solution that fills one or some holes that exist in the existing alternatives, then you can gain another leg up. So filling a hole is something that can serve as a really strong, unique selling proposition. In other words, how are you different? If the existing solution someone is using is not quite filling all of their needs, well, maybe your app does. And maybe that is something that's a really unique selling point for you, which will draw people to you. Now, the danger of not filling some sort of hole is that you're going to be competing with solutions that are really just the same as yours. So let's say there are a handful of other apps that do what your app is intended to do, and you just kind of build the same thing. Well, if there's nothing that differentiates it or fills a hole, well, you have to think about how you're going to compete with those other products. Now, generally what happens is products that are the same end up competing on price, because that's the one thing where if all the features are the same, you can change the price. But generally the way that works is it's kind of a race to the bottom. Who can charge the least? And whoever is okay with the smallest margins is going to win that war. So really, if you don't have any hole that you're filling, and you do have some sort of competition in the market, then there's a good chance you'll end up in a price war, or rather a race to the bottom, which is not really something you want to do. It's not something that's sustainable for you long term, and it's hard to scale like that. So passion, filling a hole. The next one is serving a niche. So sometimes people try to build an app that is everything for everyone. In other words, you try to build an app that has all the features you could possibly think of to solve all the problems that you could possibly think of related to whatever it is your app does, that serves all the people you could possibly think of. You're trying to create a behemoth of an app that does everything for everyone. And this isn't the route we like to suggest, because when you do that, you typically end up being nothing for no one, because there's no specific selling point, there's no point of connection with your target users. And usually what ends up happening is you do a lot of things not all that well. Maybe you're mediocre at a lot of different things, at providing a lot of different features and a lot of different outcomes, but they're all just kind of mediocre. Well, you're going to have a hard time really providing value that way, and thus growing into a valuable company. And instead, if you niche down, you can become more of a specialist. And instead of trying to do everything at once, you can do one or maybe two things. You can focus on one problem, one outcome, and get really, really good at it. And when you can do that, number one, people are going to want and need your app and have a hard time leaving your app. And number two, you can usually charge a lot more when you become more of a specialist. And when you get really good at solving one problem and providing one outcome, over time, you can start to build on that as well. So if you solve one problem and provide one outcome really well, what's the next level of that, where you can build on top of the first level? And instead of building out, you can build kind of up and out, which is much better. So when you're niching down, you can become more of a specialist, which has a lot of advantages. And when you do this, you are not letting yourself kind of slip into the trap of becoming nothing for no one when you're really trying to be everything for everyone. So you avoid the nothing for no one. Now, moving into the next circle here, the other thing that I want you to think about that a lot of people, they kind of overlook early on, are your existing contacts. A lot of people don't talk about this as being any sort of validation indicator, or even any sort of value indicator or competitive advantage, really, but it can serve as all three of those things. When you are building an app for a specific market, if you have existing contacts in place within that market, that's a very good sign. Number one, right off the bat, it tells me that you have some sort of tie to that industry or that market. And this again goes back to one of the initial things that we talked about, which is trying to just build an app by focusing on the features or the product versus focusing on a problem, a solution, and an outcome. If you have existing contacts and thus you have ties to the industry, insight, knowledge related to the industry, that tells me there is a much better chance you're thinking of problem, solution, outcome versus product and features. And that right there is a very initial sign of validation, really, just having that industry insight or experience. So by having existing contacts, I can kind of by default already assume that you have some of that there. Now, when you do have existing contacts, so it can go beyond that as well, because really it's a sign of you having an initial set of default users. And default users are really good to have, because when you're launching your app, it's hard, especially when you are a solo founder or maybe you're a small team. It's hard to build the product. And if you're using no-code tools, you're probably building the product largely yourself, or maybe all by yourself. So it's hard to build the product and market, launch, sell the product, all the business stuff. It's really hard to balance those things. But if you have existing contacts and thus you have default users, people who you already know would be good as beta users, well, then you don't have to think so hard about how you're going to split up time between your app's initial development with the first version and how you're going to get your first users on your first version. And that can be a really big conundrum for a lot of people, honestly. And so the existing contacts, while it sounds incredibly simple and straightforward, it's one that you shouldn't take lightly because it gives you quick access. And remember, we're talking about early traction indicators, and this is without a doubt one of them. You have really quick access to your market, so you can just move straight from development into your first launch and testing phases. And it also means that you need generally less of a marketing push early on. And this is one of the things that holds a lot of people back. When you don't have some initial group of default users or some existing contacts who you could turn into your default users, then you do have to put a lot more time into figuring out how you're going to get your first users, obviously. And it's just a hard thing to balance. And especially if you've never launched an app before, and if you have also never built a user base or a customer base before, trying to do both of those things from scratch at the same time, it's not easy. So having existing contacts can help you a lot with that. Now, the next thing, we have two more here, is unique skill set. Now, this is an interesting one that I really like. And it's kind of similar to the passion factor that we first talked about, but having unique skill sets can give you a major leg up. It can give you definite validation, and it can give you a really strong competitive advantage early on. If you have unique skill sets related to anything involved in providing this solution to your market, in other words, industry experience. For example, a lot of our own clients have careers in their industries, or maybe they're really avid consumers even in their industries, or they have some sort of background that gives them a unique skill set, which allows them to solve the problem that their app is being intended to solve. Now, a lot of them come into this already knowing how to solve the problem in other ways, and therefore they can take all of that insight and that knowledge, package it up into a more automated solution, an app. That's a unique skill set that, if you have that, if you already know how the problem affects people, the types of processes needed to solve it, the validation that you have for building out a more streamlined or well-packaged solution to that problem is naturally strong. But it goes outside of that too, the unique skill sets being an advantage for you, or an early traction indicator. Because if you have anything else that could sort of correlate with building and launching an app, any other experience, for example, let's say you do have some sort of marketing experience. Well, by default, that side of launching your app's already going to be a little bit easier. Maybe you have sales experience. Maybe you have experience working with spreadsheets in some way. Well, that by default is going to give you a little bit of an easier time just thinking in the way that a lot of no-code tools work. So if you're coming into this and you haven't launched an app before, well, you might have lots of other skill sets that can serve as advantages to you and that can help you build really quick traction. So one of the ways I like to look at this is you can create a significant internal advantage for yourself. So really just something to help you move a lot more quickly, or maybe balance out the things that you have to do in order to build and launch your app. Because, okay, if you know you're going to be able to have an easier time with one thing, well, you can dedicate more time to the thing you know is going to be a little bit more challenging. It really just helps you prioritize and move forward with your product a lot faster. On the flip side, if you don't have any sort of correlating skill sets, anything that's going to serve as an advantage when you are building and launching your app, honestly, you're just going to need more help. It's pretty simple, right? But if you do need that additional help in certain areas. For example, if you don't have any experience or insight related to the industry your app is going to be serving, well, you're probably going to want to partner up with someone who does, or at least team up somehow to gain that insight. You're going to need help. If you don't have any of the skills, or if you're not open to learning any of the skills that it takes to build an app, to launch an app, to grow an app, well, you're just going to need more help. Now, this doesn't have to be a detractor to your early traction, but if you need it, then you need it. And it's something to think about and be aware of. Now, beyond that, we have one more, and this is one that I really like. And it's something that we practice a lot and that we have seen to be a big driver in early traction and just ongoing long-term traction. And that is service. And I love this one again because it's not quite so technical. A lot of people really just think features, product, when they're thinking about validation, when they're thinking about value, when they're thinking about competitive advantages. But features and product are pretty easy to copy. Also, they're not really new. There's not a lot that's revolutionary. And even if you have something that is revolutionary and that's actually valid, that people actually need, when you launch that, it's going to be relatively easy to copy because features are easy to copy. But that's not a bad thing. You can have tons and tons of different solutions for the same problem that are all incredibly successful, but different things can make them successful aside from features and product. And that's why I love this service factor, because it's not necessarily something that someone else can see and copy from you. Yes, they can try to provide the same level of service to your users, but it's kind of like passion, really. It comes from you. It comes from something other than just thinking about specs or features. And so with service, I'm talking about how you help your users. This does not have to mean you need to have a 24/7 live helpline for your app. Maybe it does if that's appropriate, but that's not what I mean. I mean, how are you serving your users? Serving, because we're talking about service. A lot of people think service and they think, well, I'm going to put up an FAQ and a chat bot. And those can certainly be helpful, but are they serving your users? Serving means making sure your users are achieving the outcome that your app is there to give them. And again, if you're not thinking problem, solution, outcome, then you'll have a hard time with this. So it's not service, well, how can I just tell people more about the features? It's service in thinking, how can I make sure those features are working to provide users with an outcome? And this can happen in tons of different ways. But ultimately, if you have that in mind when you're thinking about service, if that's the thing that's driving you, outcomes, how do I give users outcomes? How do I make sure my product gives users outcomes? Then you can have a major competitive advantage over existing alternatives that are out there. So this is really a USP, a unique selling proposition that goes well beyond features, which again is so important because so few people think beyond the features. If you don't have this, if you don't have any sort of focus on how can I make sure my product is truly serving users, then you're probably going to have a higher user churn rate. Users are going to come on board potentially, but maybe not really stick around for very long because the app isn't truly serving them. So again, really important to think about. Now, to bring this back, remember, if you aren't solving a problem with your app, that's where this all starts. If you don't have that one, then nothing can branch off from that. So make sure you have that first. But if you do have this in place, then I want you to think about the passion you're bringing to this. What else is in it for you besides the potential dollar signs? Those are important. I'm not saying not to look at those, but there has to be something more, because there are going to be those highs and lows as you go through your development, your launch, your growth, your scale. What is going to take you from the lows back up to the highs? That's where the passion comes in. And that's also where you could create a really strong competitive advantage. What holes are you filling? How is your app different from other alternatives that are out there? You don't want to fall into a race to the bottom and have a price war and try to just charge less than anyone else. How else can you solve or can you serve your users' needs? And how can you niche down? When you try to be everything for everyone, you often end up being nothing for no one. So how can you become more of a specialist and then ultimately build on that instead over the long run? Do you have existing contacts? If not, that's okay, but how can you start creating them? That's going to give you a major leg up once you start to actually roll out your app. It'll allow you to have a more seamless transition from development into initial launch. Are you bringing unique skill sets into this? What's your background? What's your knowledge? What's your insight related to this problem, the process, the outcomes needed? What other skill sets can you bring into this? What skill sets are complementary that can help you build, launch, and scale your app? And they don't need to be technical. You certainly don't need to have tech skills, but you can have lots of complementary skills that help you throughout this process. And lastly, what sort of service are you providing? And remember, I want you to think about this in terms of how are you making sure your product is serving your users? Because when you do that, you are always going to have a direction. If you think of that as your North Star, how can you make sure your product serves your users? It's going to constantly guide the way. The path might change as you go, and that's okay, but it can serve as your North Star, which is very important over the long run as well. So I hope you found this helpful. And if you did, and you want to start actually building your app, you actually want to think about, okay, what features are needed in my first version? What about the next version and the next? When should I test? When should I launch to initial users? What tools should I use? If you want to move into those stages, or if you're already in them and you want to make sure you're going through correctly, we have a free workshop you can join in on at coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop that will guide you through those stages. Make sure you are building your app correctly and strategically so that you truly can launch and move into your growth stages and start growing your business and your app. So you can head to that at coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop. All right, again, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.